On average, about 8 years old is the normal age of porn being introduced into children's lives.
Wow. Does science show that the prefrontal cortex, the logic part of our brain, gets underdeveloped
Yes.
as you get involved in these addictive cycles earlier on?
Absolutely. Charlie says, I think we should have you dress more in lingerie, fake nails. You can't get an arousal with your beautiful, emotionally available wife. It has to be this persona that matches the porn you're watching.
Welcome to Hope Reforged, the podcast where we champion married couples from pornography addiction to a life of freedom, restoration, and unity. We know the road can be tough, but we're here to walk it together. It's time to break free from the chains of fear and shame. Experience Hope Reforged.
We are so glad to see you.
Thank you.
Dr. Shannan Crawford here in the house. Thank you for joining us. I'm really excited to introduce you to everybody. And we already have your website link on our website at hopereforged.com. We have a link to Crawford Clinics. You're such a wealth of knowledge, but also the care that you have for people is evident. And I've met so many of your team, all of the therapists that are on your team. I love the culture that you've built and the true focus on leading people to healing without it being a let's see, what am I trying to say? It's like sometimes we've been to counselors that just kind of drag it out and you don't see results, but the way that you go about this healing process is phenomenal. I mean, it's really results oriented.
Thank you.
So thank you. All right. Today we're going to talk about more of the brain function.
Yeah. I went into it a little bit on a previous episode, but as a layperson, not really understanding it to the level that you do. So it'll be good, I think, to do that. I'm wearing my amygdala hijack t-shirt today.
I love it.
So we can talk more about the brain.
Yes.
But tell us a little bit from your point of view, what are some of the factors involved in a person getting into this addictive cycles?
Thank you for asking. So one, it's helpful to think of all addictions similarly in the brain. So it doesn't matter if it's porn or it's a substance abuse or shopping or gambling. All of us have neural pathways that are dedicated toward pleasure. And in small doses, that's lovely and it's delightful and it makes life so fun.
Chocolate,
good glass of red wine for some, whatever. And so that's a great part of the brain. The problem is anything that we turn to and it becomes an addiction means you're now overutilizing. And so whatever you use a lot, the brain will dedicate more resources, neural pathways, more energy to that space and less to your other areas. So what you'll see is the front of the brain where you make executive reasoning, long-term consequences, you're making good choices. The front of the brain actually starts to decrease in size and matter over prolonged use, not like a one-off, right? We're talking the addiction cycle, and more energy is going to those regions of where the dopamine reward pathway. And so that activation, it really causes the brain to have to use too many resources to the back and the primal brain rather than to the executive reasoning. So you'll see work and focus, concentration, reckless decisions where people are like, how did you not think the porn was going to be seen on your work computer? Because literally the front of the brain is actually reducing, not like a scale, but like you have less energy going there because all you want to do is get that reward, that next high. And so if we understand that, then we're like, oh, that's why people make reckless decisions. They have a hard time focusing when their spouse is talking. A lot of times the spouse feels like, I don't feel like you're with me. A lot of times that's actually because the brain is so fixated with the next time I get that high, that reward pleasure in the back of the brain instead of being engaged in the front.
The way that God created our brains is absolutely amazing. It's mind-blowing, no pun intended. But isn't that, you're talking about the frontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex, isn't that the last part of the brain that develops?
Yes.
And so it's kind of the first one to go when we start delving into
Absolutely.
these traps that the enemy sets up for us.
And think of the heartbreak that most people, on average, about 8 years old is the normal age of porn being introduced into children's lives.
Wow.
That's like the normal. We're saying that's younger and older. but that's the average. So if we know the brain is not fully developed and you're already starting an addiction cycle,
Right.
that's a really rough path for the rest of the brain to try to develop and compensate, when really I just want to go back to my room and play video games or look at porn or be engaged in conversations on the internet. That something is overbearing and overtaking the ability for the brain to develop and create that genesis into the neural pathways.
So do you find, or does science show that the prefrontal cortex, the logic part of our brain, gets underdeveloped
Yes.
as you get involved in these addictive cycles earlier on?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's very real. And we're seeing it with attention, focus, concentration, and the potential, not that ADHD is not real, but we're seeing a lot of kids that they're not telling their parents and their primary care physician, I'm watching porn at home.
Right.
And I'm active in all these activities that are hijacking my prefrontal. So we keep putting them on medication when we're not actually finding out what's the condition of your soul and what's the condition of your brain.
So what is it that drives people to go after this dopamine response? I mean, it's usually a result of they're trying to deal with the pain and the things that they don't like in their life, right?
Oh, yeah. So I figured I would share de-identified, a couple that I'll call him Charlie. It's not his real name. But Charlie's a really great guy, very funny. He's a leader in his church, just really brilliant business owner, married to Megan. And he, was introduced to porn as a kid, just a one-off. It was never a big deal. And he figured once I get married, it'll not be an issue anymore, right? Like it'll just magically go away.
Right.
So he marries Megan. They're in love. It's a great relationship. And then over time, he starts feeling stress at work. And so at stress at work, it's just a little bit of porn to just like cut the edge off, right? He doesn't want to burden her. She needs sleep. So he'll just go watch porn at night and then crawl back in bed and cuddle her. He's so grateful for Megan. This is not a problem in his marriage. And then life happens, more stress, more anxiety, children come. And all of a sudden, they're realizing their dynamics are changing. And so she's bickering at him. And he's just taking it like you're saying, I'm failing as a husband. I'm not good enough. And he's taking that criticism very poorly, right? And so now in their conversation going to their pastor for couples counseling, the pastor says, well, what do you think would help? And Charlie says, I think we should have you dress more in lingerie, fake nails, this exaggerated makeup and hair. That'll help. That'll help our marriage. So the pastor, without asking further questions of why his idealization has changed from the beautiful wife he married into this essentially a porn star he's trying to recreate onto his wife. Nobody's asking those questions. They're just assuming she can't withhold sex because that's bad. And nobody's actually asking, why are your appetites changing that you can't get an arousal with your beautiful, emotionally available wife? It has to be this persona that matches the porn you're watching.
Today's episode of Hope Reforged is brought to you in part by C12, a nationwide mentoring framework of transformation for Christian business leaders. Find community at joinc12.com.
And so she complies, and then she starts becoming very bitter and resentful and ugly. So now, of course, she's the bad guy because she's not nice, she's not loving, she's not honoring and respectful, instead of realizing she's being objectified. There's no intimacy,
Exactly.
There's no emotional connection, there's not really a attachment. I'm really just masturbation into a body. And so that's painful in a marriage. And so over time, they finally are like, okay, we're getting a divorce, and everybody does this. Please don't do this. The one last ditch effort is we'll go to counseling this one time before we sign the papers.
Right.
Yeah, nothing in life ever works well when it's the last ditch effort, right? So they come and they're, here's our terrible lot. Of course, it's not going to work, right? Just tell us that so we can get an excuse that we can just get out of this thing. It's terrible. And the love they had at the beginning has totally evaporated with bitterness and resentment and complaining toward both. And so I'm psychodynamic, which means we don't do counseling at a head level and behavior modification. We go deeper and we find out what's the root issue, what is the dynamic. And so we realized for Charlie, our fake name client, that he really was so identifying with being the good guy, the happy guy, the likable guy, that he had disavowed or rejected all his stress, anxiety, inadequacy feelings. So back to your pain point. What we don't like to feel, we deny, we suppress, and we bury. And so because that was never dealt with throughout life, what was an innocent little coping strategy, just look at a little porn. Other people, it might be gambling, it might be video games, whatever humans turn to, that thing just kind of medicates a little bit.
Right.
And I don't have to feel it. And so Charlie had just had this little like kitten his whole life that turned into a roaring lion that has devoured him because he's no longer able to fully have a mature adult relationship. So in brain scans, you would see that his amygdala, the fire alarm in the back of the brain, I call it Amy, like a teenage girl that's overactive.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is like a really big deal to the amygdala, like your shirt.
Right.
And so he's perceiving everything Megan is doing, and maybe some people listening, that people, whether it's at work, it's your kids, it's your spouse, it's people at church, somebody that's saying something and you're just like, oh, no, you didn't.
It's a really big deal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if we don't deal with conflict, then I suppress it and I go, I'm good, I'm fine. I'm telling myself the story, I'm fine. But really, that energy of trapped emotion is still stored in the brain. So you need a release.
Yeah.
So depending on what we choose as our medication to release, porn is an easy one.
Mm-hmm.
So you watch pleasure, you avoid your real life, you don't feel inadequate, and you're actually stepping in to feminine energy, which is fascinating. Takes us back to our childhood where you were the recipient of the breast when we're getting breastfeeding, right?
Okay.
So I'm the recipient as the woman and the scenario, or man on man, whatever people are watching, that they're watching this dynamic and their inner world is back in that child receptive. So I never feel inadequate with porn. I never get rejected.
Right.
I never put myself out there.
Yep.
And I'm just being breastfed metaphorically. So
Yeah.
it's kind of taking us back to that first desire to be worthy, to be
Nurtured.
attached, to be nurtured. And the irony of a negative feedback loop is he's not nurturing Megan. So she's not nurturing him.
Right.
And instead of leaning into relationship,
Yeah.
he's leaning into porn where he's getting pseudo nutrients. It medicates, calms down the amygdala. And so then he feels better. And then he's got this whole narrative. We'll do another episode on
Sure.
beliefs and all of those. So he's got this whole narrative about how what he's doing, he's actually the victim to this mean, oppressive wife who isn't taking care of him, poor thing. Oh man, this is such a sad story, right?
Right.
Because we all tell ourselves stories that are congruent so that I don't have to feel shame.
We all want to be the hero of our story.
Exactly. Otherwise, we don't tell that story. We tell a different one.
Right.
We adapt it. And so his brain is under functioning. And then what happens is you watch a certain kind of porn and you get a pathway, right? You get activation, dopamine. But then over time, there's not actual intimacy. Think of it like cotton candy versus protein.
Yeah.
You're not getting a steak dinner that satisfies and builds you up. You're getting cotton candy that has a little bit of a high, but then it's gone.
Yeah.
And so then you have to go to a different kind of porn. And so that's where you'll see actually people don't mean to, but they'll get into child porn. They'll get into animal. They'll get into orgies. They'll get into all of these things because the appetite, it's called habituate, where the brain no longer releases the neural pathways and the dopamine activation because that doesn't satisfy anymore. And so that's the level of addiction where he was petting the kitty metaphorically of just a little bit of porn here. It's no big deal. It's no big deal. Now we're just talking about stress, finance, work, whatever. Now she's, cranky and up with the kids and that's miserable. So poor me, I have to go over here and medicate that so that I can still be a good husband and show up and lead at business and at work and church. And he's not realizing, actually, you're giving your heart and your affection somewhere else. She's feeling alone. And in that emptiness, now both of us are orphans emotionally.
Right.
So she's going to complain because she's still hoping for attachment. He's going to withdraw because he's feeling inadequate. And now we have this combination where nobody is feeling seen and known. And the natural solution is divorce.
And then you're adding to the stress and it's getting worse and it's just this downward spiral.
Exactly. And we live in a culture of quick fix, behavior modification. We'll just have more sex. We'll just respect each other. We'll go on a date night. We'll ask these fun questions on date night. Nobody's actually dealing with the heart issues and the neuroscience. You're actually changing your brain, your appetite. So sex with his wife feels lackluster and boring, telling him he's not in love with her anymore, when in reality, your brain created such a heightened addiction that normal sex feels bland. You have to now introduce like whips and chains and weird stuff in order to exaggerate that response in the brain. And that's the enslavement of porn.
And then all of a sudden, the slave realizes, they look up and say, "Oh my gosh, what am I doing? This isn't right."
This isn't what I dreamed.
Yeah. How does Charlie get through? So he starts dealing. If he's willing,
Yes.
to start dealing with those wounds in his past,
Right.
How does he get free?
Yeah. So at Crawford Clinics, we're still doing couples counseling, but we're separating. So each of us have our own individual attachment styles and then brain conditioning.
Yeah.
You don't solve a couple problem with individual issues, right? This is the playground where all of your issues come out.
Right.
Of each of your individual issues, right?
And they come out quite well.
Oh gosh, there is nothing like the progressive sanctification of iron sharpening iron, right? So we separate him and we go back to just early childhood experiences, birth order, having an older brother that he felt kind of less than an inferior, a dad that was kind of John Wayne, who was physically in his life, but he didn't feel very affirmed and celebrated. He had a mom that was kind of overbearing in a loving way, not in a bad way, but in like a loving way. All of those messages saying, we don't think you have what it takes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Nobody said that sentence to him, but a portion of his inner world formed a belief. And that's what we'll talk about in our next episode. And that belief system now got encased deep inside because that's too threatening. Nobody walks around with your core belief conscious, right? I am unworthy. It doesn't just hang out here. We deny it, we block it, and then we overcompensate. So he's friendly, he's helpful, he's the best of the best, model citizen, runs a business, he is leader at the church, he's doing all these things. Unconsciously, he has no idea that this child part of him is very hurt, encapsulated in pain and loneliness. So then when the enemy wants to strike, he just waits. Strategically, he hits right at the point where that marriage is most vulnerable. They're both sleep deprived. They're stressed. They're overwhelmed. You know, the honeymoon phase is kind of worn off.
Yep.
Real life is hitting. And those pain places have actually been there the whole time. It just happens to be coming out now because the enemy knows that'll take them out the worst.
Yes.
Right? So a lot of us think, oh, that'll never happen to me. And I've really learned to say there, but by the grace of God go I, because I don't know what I'm capable of until enough factors and the enemy hits and strikes those areas. So we use restoring self-cohesion. It's a mouthful. Sorry. It's just what it's called. Psychology makes things too long. I don't know. So restoring self-cohesion, and we actually use our imagination. It's not new age. It's not hypnosis, but we go in and we actually engage with those parts of self. So the protector that protest too much, I don't deal with inadequacy. I'm the leader. I'm the strong one. I'm there for everybody else. You know, honey, if you need a shoulder to cry on, I'll be there for you. But he never actually allows himself to let someone be there for him.
Right.
And so that was an area where Jesus had never gotten permission to be his hero. There's never a surrender in that space. And so the protector is a part of our soul, which is our human mind, will, and emotions. And then our spirit man is the part of me that's meant to connect with the Father. And when my soul is stepping in front, it's like there's a wall or a barrier that I can't access the grace of God.
Right.
So a lot of people are wondering, like, why am I so good at, you know, tithing or fasting or believing God for this? And I can believe God for a business and I can, you know, step into these spaces. Why do I still struggle with this? Because there's an ecosystem. There's many parts of us. Let us make man in our image. There's different parts of us. So these parts are free. They're operating in their kingdom assignment. Your spirit man is leading. Wherever the soul is leading, that's the flesh or the unregenerated man, unsanctified, what Apostle Paul called. And so that part of me is still having to rely on the things of the flesh to try to medicate this sense of loneliness and disconnect on the inside. If we never go inside and we always stay with behavior modification, nobody is ever getting to that space of saying, hey, Father, actually, I am really hurt. I am scared. I am overwhelmed. I do have a core belief that I had no idea. And I invite you, I surrender into this intimacy, into that place. And when that happens, Charlie's spirit man comes back online. He's able to repent of turning to this idol of porn as a false medication, a false comforter. And when he releases that, now it's like, oh my gosh, Lord, true repentance happens. And when true repentance happens, it says the Lord resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. And it's so neat because Megan's going through her journey because she's human too, right? And so we're working on both sides. This is not a lopsided. Women deal with porn as much as guys do, right? So that just happened to be the story we're leaning in this moment. But Megan had all of her attachment where she's wanting him to be her source and her God, and her little girl feeling of dad abandoning and walking out when she was little. And then making this husband, you're my source. And when you're not, then I'm critical, I'm mean, and I'm acting out. Both of those are very real. And when you separate people and you work on the unconscious dynamics, we bring them back into what we call cohesion or harmony on the inside. Now they dance together. Now their intimacy, their playfulness. Now they can re-date and re-engage. And now, years later, they'll still send pictures of, here's our kid graduating and here's where we are today. And it's just honoring. It's a hugely touching part of my life of getting to invest into couples and then see the transformation in their lives.
It's funny. You're talking about Charlie and Megan. I'm like, is she really talking about us? It'd just be Chris and Angela.
It's a pretty common story.
Yeah.
Well, and so many of us try to make something else our God. I mean, we're built to worship.
Yes.
What is that going to be? Is it going to be, my husband, or is it going to be the only one who should be worshipped?
Yes.
That it would be Jesus.
Yeah.
Can you go back just for a minute to the imagination? You're kind of keying into the imagination of people, but it's a sanctified imagination, right? It's like you said, it's not New Age. It's not hypnosis. It's truly the imagination is a gift from the Lord.
Absolutely.
And so he wants to work through that to heal us.
Absolutely. Isn't that so fun?
It's amazing.
Everything God created has a purpose and a design,
Yes.
But the enemy perverts it.
Yeah.
And so we use it for a soulish imagination, a fantasy of something, versus actually opening where Jesus said, you have eyes to see, ears to hear and understand, or you see, but you don't see, right? So he's talking about a different spiritual view. So with my clients, I'll say imagination. Actually, I believe we're tapping into them seeing with eyes that see, right? That I have a whole ecosystem inside of me, and I'm learning how to engage those parts of me and bring them back to the Father. And many of my clients will say, I don't see anything. My mind's blank. And I'll go, okay, can you picture your bedroom at home? Oh yeah, fine. Can you picture your grandma? Can you picture your spouse? Blah, blah. Your imagination works just fine. But when I haven't been taught to cultivate my inner world, then I think it's not working and or I don't want to. And we have free will. And so many people have a fear that if I go inside and I start feeling and I open those doors, it's going to get so dark and so bad that I'll never get out. I'll get in this depressive hole. And so it's just easier to self-medicate. It's just easier to just be the strong one, helpful for everybody else, and be the martyr and not deal with me. The problem with that narrative is you're not actually a martyr, right? You're actually hurting people.
Yeah.
When you emotionally withdraw and reject and are trying to be the strong one, but they don't get intimacy from you, that is actually hurting other people. And yet it's a common narrative where I'm the strong one. I'm there for everybody else. And I don't realize actually they're just craving you. People don't need Superman or Superwoman. They don't need the martyr mom that's available for everybody. They need a human to attach to. And so what we do is we say, I reject the belief. I reject the belief that I don't want to see inside, that I'm not capable of seeing inside. I welcome the reality and truth that it's safe to see inside and that I want to. It'll be good for me and I'll actually feel lighter at the end of it.
Yeah.
So most of the time, amygdala, these fear responses that it's going to be so bad, so dark, I don't want to think about it, I don't want to go there. Instead, if you just do little tiny bits, just like going to the gym, just little bits over time has a huge impact.
Yeah.
And then kind of like releasing the valve on the inside, it relaxes and your inner world doesn't have that pent up energy that you have to use your addiction to try to cut the edge off and release the intensity of what's going on inside.
Well, and I think that's difficult for guys too, because you're fighting this masculine stereotype that I cannot be vulnerable.
Yes.
Right. I cannot be shown as weak.
Right.
I don't know what sort of instinctual level is going on there, if it goes way back to, caveman stuff or what, but I mean, it's there.
Yes.
It's the way we were designed.
Yeah.
And so it's relearning the habit of opening up and being vulnerable is a process.
It is. Yeah. It's like having armor and deciding in a few relationships, not all, right?
Sure.
In a few relationships, not your secretary at work. Let's open up and let love in. Let's let somebody see me and know me and trust that I'm unconditionally loved and I'm still masculine in that state.
Yeah.
And I think ironically, to your point, we actually live in a culture of extreme dichotomy right now, where we have the masculine John Wayne generation that men don't cry, they're not weak, they're the strong one, they're the provider, they take care of the family, they're the rock. We also now have a strong swing, millennial down to Z,
Yeah.
of the baby girl. So these guys that are considered like a girl boy, and you are emotional and you do let women take care of you. And so that's a very odd dichotomy that we're living in culture right now, where the guy is so emotionally available that it's actually on the feminine side. And so then again, you see the polarization and go, oh, I don't want to be that, right? Yeah. But I also don't want to be that. And we're not seeing the sweet middle space of healthy masculinity, being strong, being can I say badass? Like being the leader, the person you're supposed to be, and in select relationships, taking the armor off with the right people that we can trust and allowing that place of intimacy that is so sacred. And that is when women have orgasms because you emotionally connected more than just physically.
I think a lot of, again, I'm a real big movie buff, so I tend to look at those sort of things, but I see a lot of women like looking at like Viggo Mortensen, his character in Lord of the Rings, as kind of being that sort of sweet middle spot, right? Where he was super masculine, but he was also really soft and tender and everything.
He sings a song.
Right. Right. And that, like, that's kind of what, I mean, and there's like a whole subculture of women that are like drooling over this fantasy guy, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's because you don't see that much represented.
Right.
In a whole lot of spaces.
Absolutely.
It's the one or the other. I mean, there's a post I saw of a bunch of guys riding, basically their adult size tricycles around the neighborhood at night, because they're trying to get in touch with their childhood, basically, Yes.
I haven't heard about that.
Yeah. So we're in a weird place culturally. There's a lot of different ideas being thrown around, and I think it's an overreaction to the super hard, unavailable,
stoic, strong guy that has to be the rock,
right? Which is what I think people do. It's like if I got my dad who's the alcoholic, I'm going to totally swing the other way, and I'm going to overcompensate.
Exactly. And so in our next episode, when we talk about inner vows, we'll pick that up.
Yeah.
Because that is a big part of a lot of what we're going to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah. Man, it's really good. Because I think part of the thing for me, when I don't know that when I was going through my deliverance and my process out of pornography, we didn't really dive into a whole lot of the brain dynamics to this level. And there's so much more that's coming out now in terms of what we know about the brain. But learning all this stuff now, I think for me is a huge part of it, because you understand that, like, how the brain is working and why it is so difficult to get out of these things.
Yes, absolutely.
And it's so liberating, I think, to a certain degree, because you now start to see that, it's not just, I'm not just a bad person, right? There's natural processes that I have hijacked that are causing me to stay in this broken place. And I'm not addressing the brokenness. I'm just trying to deal with the behavioral issue, and I'm still stuck here. And why am I still stuck here? And it's now starting to understand it, I think, to this level is really because you're not a bad person.
It's so validating.
You're trying in your own natural process to deal with all the brokenness in your life. And you've got to get down to the root of that, and you got to deal with it.
Exactly. We can see so clearly the value of surrounding yourself with the right people, not the ones that are those condemning voices, because we've got enough of that from the enemy, coming at us.
Absolutely.
So I think, finding that counselor who gets it, who can help take you through those steps. So tell us about a success. Is Charlie, like, okay, you said he's still in kind of the individual process, but.
So what we find is when your spirit man leads, you naturally have the fruit of the spirit. One of the fruit of the spirit is self-control.
Yes.
Isn't that awesome?
That is.
So wherever my spirit goes back into regression and gets spooked, and I go back to old patterns, my soul takes over, and then you'll see relapse. No big deal. I teach my clients not to freak out and to be like, oh my God, I'm a failure. But like, hey, soul, what caused you to freak out and take over control? Because we have free will.
Good question.
And I get to do that.
That's a good question.
As a human being, I get to hide, retreat, judge somebody else, blame myself, do whatever I need. Just be kind. So our motto at Crawford Clinics is kind and curious. So we're kind and curious toward the part of me that said, I'm not operating in self-control. What's going on inside? What part of me just got scared, overwhelmed, felt inadequate, felt unloved, unworthy. I love you. I see you. And I invite you back into the presence of the Father where there's unconditional love. And a key is we actually have to take masks off where we unconsciously project, just like a projector screen, that I'll take my past experience and I'll overlay that onto a spouse, onto God, onto a pastor, a coworker, a child. Our unconscious mind does not see reality as our conscious mind, right? And so then when we present the Father, we actually have to take masks, male and female. It's not gender specific, of over-domineering parents, unavailable parents. A lot of people see God like Abraham Lincoln, where he's stoic and big and kind of far away and serious.
Right.
Or Zeus. I saw God and I love Jesus. And when I did the work on myself for another issue, I saw him like Godzilla. And if I want something, God's going to take it away. He's going to smash it and destroy it.
Interesting.
Wow.
I love Jesus. That had never crossed my mind in my entire life. But inside me, based on a projection, had put that overlaid on top of Father God. And so I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't have my quiet time. Oh, I did this thing wrong. I didn't do this. And so this bad thing's happening now.
Right.
And I didn't realize that was actually a projection from childhood. And so that's why restoring self-cohesion is valuable for all kinds of things, but especially addiction, because then I can be kind and curious instead of behavior modification, where our culture, I think, actually is teaching people emotional eating disorders.
Yeah.
You restrict, and then eventually you cave, and then you feel bad and you overindulge and you watch or drink too much or you do whatever too much. And you never actually deal with, hey, soul, what's causing you to get so stressed and overwhelmed that feels like the only thing I can do?
Yeah.
And when you lean into intimacy, even with yourself, and this was interesting. A man once said intimacy with myself, like that immediately meant masturbation.
Oh no.
Like our culture is so sexualized.
Yes, absolutely.
That into me, you see. If that is so sexualized that all people know is pornography or sex or masturbation as intimacy, doesn't it make sense that we have a over-sex drive culture that doesn't know how to actually talk about our thoughts and our feelings and be known deeply and seen? And when that happens, the natural euphoria of sex is magical. It's the kingdom. It's the way it's supposed to be because it's the culmination of all parts of self being known and seen and valued. It's the antithesis or the solution against the habituating to having to go to this kind of sex and this many partners. And we're seeing an increase of people switching partners and adding situations to their things and all that.
Right.
That's because there's not actual seen and known level of intimacy. And it always just comes back to sex. Mm-hmm. And how empty and debased is that if we're really just animals who have to just get off?
Right.
Instead of human beings that are deeply known, deeply seen and valued, connected.
Yeah.
And doing that with myself first versus expecting my partner to do it. Women in particular are guilty of that one. And learning how to see and know and then bring myself to my partner. Mm-hmm. That is beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good.
You've really helped us think about how our brain function is just much, much more than, the surface level is just, I'm bad.
Yeah.
But then thank you for extrapolating all of that information into kind of the core is God's made us a certain way, and we're going to find a way to worship no matter what our background is. So that's really good. And just the hope that we can be completely restored.
Yes.
That's so beautiful.
It's massive.
Well, I look forward to talking with you next time when we can dig more into the connections there, the beliefs and everything. Mm-hmm. And we looking real forward to that. And we'll talk to everybody next time.
Thank you for joining us on Hope Reforged. Together, we can break the chains of addiction and rebuild hope. To stay connected, visit us at www.hopereforged.com, where you'll find new episodes, resources, and support. If you found this helpful, please leave us a review and share it with someone who would be encouraged by this podcast. Until next time, persevere, lean into hope, and remember that restoration is yours.